evening was falling on the city, coloring it with the dim light of the street lamps. A dark-skinned teenager, leaning on crutches, walked slowly down the sidewalk, each step accompanied by the thud of metal against concrete. A small dog with pointed ears and wary eyes trotted beside him, its tail twitching nervously. It was as if it sensed something was wrong. The boy, 16-year-old Marcus, gripped the handles of his crutches so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His leg, in a cast from a recent accident, whimpered dully from the long journey. But he didn't allow himself to complain. He was the kind of man who was used to enduring. If you show weakness, they'll exploit it. The voice of his father, an activist who had spent his life teaching him to stand proud no matter what. The dog stopped and looked alertly ahead. A figure appeared in the shadow of the building, a tall man in a uniform with a police badge on his chest. His eyes were fixed on Marcus as if he had already done something terrible, even though he was only walking home. Marcus slowed his step. His dog growled quietly, but enough for the policeman to hear. The teenager's heart beat faster. He knew what that look meant. It was the same one he'd seen in the eyes of the security guard at the store who'd accused him of stealing even though he was just picking out chips, or in the face of the teacher who had once called him a problem student, despite his good grades. It was the look of someone who had decided in advance who you were. Marcus straightened up as far as his crutches would allow and took another step. His dog huddled closer to his leg, still eyeing the policeman warily. The uniformed figure moved toward him. "Hey, stop! Where are you going?" A voice boomed sharply. Marcus felt a dry lump rise in his throat, but he didn't stop. He was 3 blocks from home. Just 3 blocks. Just a few steps between him and safety, between him and the backyard where his father was probably working on another letter against police brutality. But every next step seemed harder, as if this stranger in uniform were draining him of his strength by his mere presence. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The voice grew louder, sharper. The policeman stepped forward, so close that you could see his hand on his belt, where the taser was hanging. Marcus's dog growled louder, the fur on its back standing up. The teenager stopped. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to get home. But something about this evening, the heavy air and those colorless eyes of the policeman, told him that trouble had already found him. 3 blocks from home. But it feels like he's 3 steps away from disaster. The policeman stood on the corner like a shadow dissolving into the twilight of the streetlights. His massive figure seemed to fill the entire sidewalk, and his gaze, cold and hard, pierced the dark-skinned teenager on crutches before he even approached. Marcus felt that look, as if it were a spotlight aimed directly at him. The hand on his crutch was sweating, and he wiped his palm discreetly on his jeans. His dog, the little mutt he trusted more than people, froze and growled softly. "What are you doing here?" The policeman's voice cut through the air, sharp and demeaning as a blow. The words flew not as a question, but as an accusation. Marcus slowed his step, but didn't stop. He was a dark-skinned teenager in this neighborhood, and he knew that in itself was already a crime in some people's eyes. "I'm just going home," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice calm, but he heard a note of fear slip in. "Going home?" The policeman tilted his head to the side, his tone full of sarcasm. "On crutches, with a dog? How long has it been since thieves started masquerading as lame people?" Marcus felt rage flare up inside him, but he swallowed it down. He'd learned that a long time ago. Don't give in. Don't show you're hurt. It would only make it worse. His father had said that sometimes there was more power in silence than in words, but in this moment, silence felt like a rope around his neck. Marcus's dog growled again. The cop took a step forward, looming over the teenager. "Get your mutt out of here before he gets hurt," he growled, keeping his eyes on the boy. His hand slid to his belt where the taser hung. Marcus gripped his crutches so tightly his fingers ached. "She won't do anything. She's just scared," he replied quietly. But there was no room for reason in the policeman's voice. "Scared?" The policeman grinned, gritting his teeth. "That's funny. Usually you blacks are so cocky when there's a lot of you, but when there's just one, it's a different matter." The words hit Marcus like a punch. He wanted to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. He lowered his gaze to his dog, who was hiding behind his leg, her fur standing on end. She was ready to lunge, but she couldn't figure out what to do. She could feel his fear. "I said stop!" The policeman shouted the order so loudly that the sound reverberated off the walls of the houses. Marcus froze. His dog barked, thin and fierce, trying to protect him, but it only made the officer angrier. In that moment, the teen realized that nothing he said or did could change the situation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a trap. The cop had already decided who he was. Not a person, not a kid on crutches with a dog, but a threat to be suppressed. Anxiety flooded him like a wave. Every muscle in his body screamed, "Run!" But where could he run to? He was on crutches. He wouldn't make it. He wouldn't win. Marcus took another step back, hoping it would defuse the situation, but it was a mistake. The cop took it as a challenge. Something dark lit up in his eyes, something that made the teenager's heart clench. "Ah, you decided to play with me?" The officer's voice became lower, almost menacingly soft. He pulled out the taser and stepped closer. "Come on, let's see how brave you are." Marcus gripped the dog's leash tighter in his hand, not to hold it, but to feel that he wasn't alone. But nothing could prepare him for what was to come next. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Maybe there have been situations in your life that made you feel unjust or powerless. We want to know what you think. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so you don't miss the next stories. And now we continue. I said, "Stay where you are." The policeman's voice broke the evening silence, its harshness resonating in the air like a lash. The dark-skinned teenager on crutches froze, his dog clinging to his leg, growling low and muffled. Marcus turned to the officer, trying to look calm, though panic raged inside him. He already knew this was no ordinary meeting. This was a test that could end in anything. "Sir, I'm just going home," he said, trying to speak evenly. His voice shook, but he did his best not to make it sound like fear. "Home, then?" The policeman slowly stepped closer, squinting his eyes. "I know you're kind. You're always just going somewhere until it turns out you've been stolen somewhere or scared somewhere." Those words hit Marcus like rocks. He felt his throat constrict. He wanted to object, wanted to shout that it wasn't true, but he'd learned by now that there was no point in arguing with people like that. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said quietly, taking a small step back. But that step only irritated the policeman. "Why are you backing off? Afraid I'll find something on you? Or did your mutt do something, huh?" The policeman nodded at the dog, who now stood between him and Marcus as if trying to protect his master. Marcus gritted his teeth. He knew that every word or movement he made would only make things worse, but the silence was unbearable. "She's just a dog, sir. She's as scared as I am," he squeezed out. "Scared? Good. Should be afraid." The officer smirked, his hand resting on his holster as if it were a familiar gesture he repeated every time to show who was in charge. "Sir, please, my leg is just broken. I'm coming home." Marcus's voice shook, and he hated himself for it. He heard how it sounded, too quiet, too vulnerable. "What did you do before that? Walking through other people's yards? Or were you just waiting for the right moment?" The policeman stepped closer, his shadow now blocking the lantern's light. His gaze was full of contempt. Marcus felt the ground go out from under his feet. He took another step backward, and his crutch slipped along a crack in the pavement. He almost fell, but he held on. The policeman grinned. "Look at you. You can run on crutches, too. Do you know how many people like you I have to chase every day? You think I can't see who you are?" The officer's words, each one like a gunshot, filled the air with heaviness. Marcus felt the fear become an almost tangible, cold lump in his chest. His dog barked, taking a step forward, but immediately stopped when he heard his voice. "No, girl, it's okay." He spoke more to her than to himself, because nothing was normal. The policeman laughed, but there was no mirth in that laugh. It was the laugh of a man who knew he was allowed to do anything. He slowly pulled out a taser and pointed it at the dog. "I said stop, or that's the last thing your mutt will see." The words cut through the air like a blade. At that moment, Marcus realized that whatever happened next was no longer up to him. The policeman stepped closer, his boots thudding on the sidewalk. There was a silence in the air, tense as a thunderstorm. The dark-skinned teenager on crutches froze in place, trying not to make any sudden movements. His dog growled louder, his thin paws tense as if he were preparing to jump. "Didn't you understand what I said? I told you to stand still." The officer shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the empty houses. "Sir, I'm standing. Ye—" Marcus began, but didn't have time to finish. The policeman jerked forward sharply, grabbing him by the shoulder. There was no thought or restraint in that movement. It was an act of pure aggression. The jerk knocked the teenager off balance. One of the crutches slipped from his hand and fell to the pavement with a clatter. Marcus staggered, his dog barking to stop the stranger's hands, but his barking only fueled the officer's rage. "Are you fighting back? You think I can't calm you down?" The policeman gritted his teeth. His grip grew tighter, and he pushed Marcus so hard he couldn't hold on. The fall was slow but inevitable. A metal crutch jingled and flew off to the side. A second crutch followed. Marcus collapsed to the ground, his cast hitting the pavement with a thud. Pain pierced his leg, but worse than the pain was the anger he felt at himself for being so helpless. The policeman stood over him like a rock. "There you are. You sure as hell ain't getting away now," he hissed, as if he were a dangerous criminal, not a dark-skinned teenager, unarmed, on crutches, with a dog. The dog lunged forward, but the short leash stopped it. She barked furiously, ignoring the threat. Her small teeth bared, she reached for her master's abuser, but her small body against the huge uniformed figure looked pitiful. "Your mutt wants to play too?" The cop slowly pulled out a taser, pointing it directly at the dog. Marcus, lying on the ground, raised his hands. "No, leave her alone. She won't do anything. She's as scared as I am," he shouted, trying to stand up, but his leg, plastered, refused to obey. "Scared, you say?" The officer grinned, grinning. "Good. Let her know who's in charge." He took a step forward, and the boot came down next to Marcus's hand with a heavy thud. The dust from the impact rose into the air, clogging the teenager's lungs. It was a show of strength, plain and simple. "Look at you, limp, useless. You think anyone's going to believe your story? You're the kind of guy we, keep in check." The cop's words poured like venom, imbuing this moment with humiliation. Marcus lay on the cold ground, feeling the dog's eyes on him, its eyes burning with fear and devotion. He clenched his fists, his fingers digging into the dusty asphalt. He knew this moment would stay with him forever. The policeman leaned closer, his face quite close. "You're a nobody here, understand? No activist, no hero's gonna save you. Remember that?" Marcus didn't answer anything. He just lay there, his breathing getting heavier and heavier, the fear in his chest getting in the way of words. And then there was the click of the taser. The dog shrieked and froze, but still stood by his master's side as if ready to defend him to the last. At that moment, Marcus realized he was alone. All alone. Marcus's dog, a small mongrel with pointy ears and loyal eyes, growled louder than he had ever heard it. She lunged forward as far as the leash would allow, protecting her master, who was still lying on the ground. Her barking was desperate, shrill. But instead of backing away, the policeman grinned, his face contorted in a contemptuous grimace. "Look how brave your dog is." He stepped closer, and his shoe hit the pavement next to the dog. The dog jumped back, but didn't retreat. Its teeth gleamed in the light of the street lamp. Marcus, a dark-skinned teenager on crutches, tried to raise himself, but the pain in his plastered leg prevented him from standing up. He screamed, his voice shaking with anger and despair. "Don't hurt her. She's just protecting me. Leave her alone." The policeman threw a look of icy contempt at him. "And you shut up before you make it worse, understand?" He straightened up, looking at the dog, who continued to bark, its small body trembling with exertion. The click of the taser sounded again, and Marcus felt a cold terror gripping him. The policeman stepped closer to the dog, raising the device in his hand. "How many times do I have to tell your mutt to quiet down? You think I won't do it?" His voice sounded calm, but there was more terror in that calm threat than in the shouting. "No!" Marcus shouted, stretching his arm out toward the dog. His eyes filled with tears, but not from pain, but from helplessness. "She hasn't done anything. She's just barking. It's her job to protect me." The words of the teenager, dark-skinned, defenseless, with crutches, were met with derision. The policeman turned his head, looking at him with a mocking grin. "Your job is to keep quiet. Or do you want me to show you who's boss? Maybe your dog will be the first to realize that," he said, his tone soaked with venom. The dog made another leap, its bark louder, angrier. It was ready to lunge, despite its small strength, despite the fact that it was confronted by a man much stronger than it. The policeman jerked forward suddenly, waving his foot toward the dog. She shrieked as his boot grazed her side. It wasn't a hard hit, but enough to knock her off balance. She fell to her side but immediately jumped up, coming between the officer and Marcus again. "That's enough," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking from the exertion. He tried to rise but collapsed again. "Leave her alone. Please, I'll do whatever you want." The policeman stopped, holding the taser in his hand. He turned slowly to Marcus, and satisfaction was evident in his gaze. "You'll do anything you say? There's nothing for you to do. You're nothing here, you lame boy with a dirty dog." Those words hit harder than any physical impact. They were calculated to destroy him, to show that he was nothing. Marcus felt something dark, indomitable growing inside him, but he couldn't let his anger show, because if he showed it, he would lose completely. His dog, despite everything, stood beside him again, growling quietly, her fur standing up. She wouldn't give up, and he couldn't. The policeman waved the taser once more, but at that moment, footsteps were heard. Somewhere ahead, passers-by began to gather, stopping to see what was happening. Some raised their phones, their cameras glowing in the darkness. "Well, lucky you, kid. You're getting away alive today," the policeman said with barely concealed disappointment. But there was a warning in his tone. "Next time, it will be different." With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving the teenager on the ground and his dog shaking with exertion. Marcus was left lying there, feeling humiliated, broken. But something new was ignited inside him, something that could no longer be suppressed. The light of a street lamp cast long shadows on the sidewalk as people began to stop around them. Someone looked out the window of the nearest house. Another slowed his step, watching a policeman looming over a dark-skinned teenager on crutches who lay on the ground, shaking with pain and humiliation. His dog still stood nearby, growling viciously but hesitant to approach the aggressive officer. "What's going on here?" came a voice. A woman carrying bags from the store stopped at the corner, her eyes widening when she saw Marcus lying on the pavement. The policeman looked back at her over his shoulder, his face contorted with displeasure. "Nothing that concerns you. Move along," he growled, taking a step toward the teenager as if deliberately blocking him from view. But the woman didn't move. She pulled out her phone, pointing the camera at the stage. "So, you think it's okay to attack a child, and on crutches?" Her voice was shaky but strong. These words caught the attention of others. People started to stop. Someone shouted from the crowd, "Hey, leave him alone!" Another person, a young guy with a baseball cap, also pulled out his cell phone. The light of the camera flash flashed, and the policeman turned sharply in his direction. "What? You think you can just shoot me like that?" The officer's voice grew even louder and angrier. His hand tensed on the taser, but he didn't put it away. He now looked like an animal that had been cornered. Marcus lifted his head, his face dirty, his cheeks tear-stained. He felt a new wave of despair rise to his throat. He knew the crowd could help, but he also knew how dangerous it was for him. "Sir, I just wanted to go home. Please let me go," he breathed out, trying to speak in a way that kept his voice steady. "Shut up," the policeman shouted, turning to the teenager. His gaze read rage. "You started this. You understand? You and your damn mutt." The dog growled louder, its small body trembling with tension. The policeman kicked the ground sharply with his boot, as if trying to frighten it. The crowd grew denser. People whispered, exchanging concerned glances. "This isn't normal. Has anyone called the other cops yet?" came a voice from the group. The policeman turned to them, his face flushed with rage. "Everyone get back. This is an official operation, and if you don't stop interfering, I'll have you all detained for obstruction of justice." "Justice?" The voice of the woman with the phone came through louder. "Is it justice to kick a teenager who can't even stand up because of his leg? Is it justice to threaten his dog?" The crowd became animated, and someone shouted out, "We saw everything." The cameras see everything. The policeman took a few steps back, his eyes darting between Marcus, the crowd, and the phones that were now pointed at him. He raised his hand as if he wanted to say something in his own defense, but then his face contorted and he pointed his finger at the teenager again. It's all because of you. People like you are always making trouble. Do you think these people will help you? They'll disperse as soon as I leave." Those words cut Marcus like a knife. He wanted to scream, wanted to say it wasn't his fault, but his voice caught in his throat. He felt like the air was too heavy for him to breathe. The policeman, realizing that his actions were being recorded, did not stop being aggressive. His hand twitched nervously, the taser still in it. Marcus felt the fear gripping him again. "Keep filming for everyone to see," suddenly shouted someone from the crowd. This shout was like a blow to the officer. He turned sharply, clenched his teeth, and bellowed, "You'll all regret this." But the people didn't back down. The phones kept filming. The light of the cameras glittered in the darkness. The policeman turned again to Marcus, who was lying on the ground, clutching the leash of his trembling dog. At that moment, the teenager felt he was no longer alone. But whether it was salvation, he did not know, because the policeman's eyes were threatening. It wasn't over yet. Before we go any further, let's pause again for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have there been times in your life when you felt injustice or powerlessness in the face of circumstances? Your thoughts are very important to us. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now, so you don't miss out on further stories. And now we continue. In the silence of the night, the phone rang. The sound of vibration on the wooden surface of the desk filled the room, where a man sat behind a pile of papers. Linton Carter, Marcus's father, had been working for hours on another article about police brutality in their neighborhood. He was known for his tireless fight for the rights of black communities, often becoming a headache for the local authorities. But now the call stopped him, like a cold wind blowing into a warm room. He picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end, rasping with excitement, thundered in his ears. "Linton! Your boy! He's been pinned down. A policeman's got him in the street. There's a crowd. People are filming everything on their phones. You've got to get over here right away." Those words were like a blow. Linton felt his body tense up. His heart skipped a beat and then pounded as if trying to burst out of his chest. He didn't ask any questions. Grabbing his keys, he glanced at the wall where pictures of his protests hung, articles about his speeches against racism and police brutality. All those years of struggle, all those hours spent in courtrooms and on the streets, suddenly came crashing down on him in a single moment. Linton knew it was inevitable. His son, a dark-skinned teenager on crutches, was already a threat to those who were used to seeing skin color as the enemy. On the way to the scene, Linton thought back to his first encounters with the police. He'd been in his early 20s the first time he'd been stopped for no reason. He was just returning from work at the time, but their looks, their words, had pierced his soul like nails. "You look like one of the men we're looking for," the officer had said then, scrutinizing him like a suspect. From then on, he knew. The system doesn't make mistakes, it deliberately chooses its target. This struggle became his life. He wrote articles, organized rallies, worked with lawyers. His face became known and his name was spoken with hatred in police circles. Several times he faced threats, from veiled innuendos to direct statements. "Carter, you've had enough of us with your marches. Don't think we won't find a way to put you in your place," an officer once told him, looking him straight in the eye. Linton learned to live with it, but he didn't give up. He fought for people like Marcus, for his son to one day be able to feel safe, and now that fight had reached the person closest to him. When Linton pulled up to the street where the crowd had gathered, he saw a familiar sight. People with phones, camera flashes, a uniformed police officer who was still standing over a dark-skinned teenager on the ground. And that teenager was his son. Marcus lay there, his face contorted with pain and fear, his crutches lying to the side and the dog still protecting him, growling viciously. Linton got out of the car, and at that moment, everything went quiet. People started whispering. Someone recognized him. "It's Carter! It's his father!" came voices from the crowd. The policeman turned around, his face changed. It was still full of anger, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. He knew who was in front of him. Linton stepped forward, his eyes burning with the fire he always saved for such occasions. "Take your hands off my son," he said, his voice as hard and low as a clap of thunder. The policeman straightened but did not move from his seat. "Your son fought back, sir. We're just doing our job," he began, but his tone no longer had the confidence it had before. "Resisted?" Linton took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "That boy on crutches. You threatened him, threatened his dog. You think that's your job? That's arbitrary. That's violence." The policeman tried to reply something, but Linton interrupted him. "You think I don't know how this works? You wanted him to look guilty. But look around. People saw everything. You think you can destroy us? You're not the first to try that." The crowd became animated and people started shouting words of encouragement. The cameras were still pointed at the policeman, who now looked confused. He knew that the name of Linton Carter had already ruined the career of a colleague who had allowed such violence to happen once before, and he knew it could happen to him too. Marcus looked up at his father, his eyes filled with tears, but there was hope in them. He had seen this man at rallies, on television, heard his speeches, but now he wasn't just an activist. He was the father who had come to save him. Linton stepped closer, his face stern. "It won't end here," he said, looking directly into the officer's eyes. His words were quiet, but there was a threat in them that could not be ignored. The policeman took a step back, and the crowd exploded with screams. The cameras kept rolling, and Linton Carter already knew that this night would be a new chapter in his struggle. Only now it was personal. The video spread faster than a fire in a dry forest. The first clips from the scene began appearing on social networks within hours. A dark-skinned teenager on crutches lying on the ground, his dog snarling angrily at a police officer, and the figure of an officer looming over him with a taser in his hand. These images, shot from different angles, went viral. Hashtags such as "Shot Justice for Marcus," "Josh Police Violence," and "Jock Equality Now" filled phone and computer screens across the country. Everyone who saw the video could not remain indifferent. People saw the suffering of a teenager who had done nothing but be born black. They saw the dog who defended his master to the last. They heard the officer's words soaked with contempt and hatred and felt their own rage grow with every second they watched. In the comments under the video, people expressed anger and shock. "How is this possible in this day and age?" wrote some. "This officer should be fired immediately," others demanded. But there were also those who defended the police officer's actions, using the old, prejudiced phrases, "something he obviously did since he was pulled over," or "why do they always play the victims?" These comments only heightened the tension, turning the virtual debate into a firestorm. The media quickly picked up the story. The morning news opened with the headlines. A policeman hit a dark-skinned teenager on crutches. Everything was filmed. A dog tried to protect its master from the aggression of an officer. The system against the innocent. Where is the limit of cruelty? The TV channels invited experts, human rights activists, former police officers. They discussed not only the incident itself, but also a deeper problem: why such cases continue to occur with frightening regularity. But the story went beyond words. Protests broke out across the country. In black neighborhoods, people took to the streets with placards demanding justice. They chanted Marcus's name, which became a symbol of a new wave of struggle for equality. "We will no longer be silent. This is not the first time, and it won't be the last if we don't change anything," shouted a woman with a megaphone standing on the steps of the city hall. Meanwhile, the policeman, whose name also became known through the leak, tried to defend himself. In an interview for a local TV station, he said, "I acted within the law." The teenager behaved suspiciously. He did not obey orders. "I didn't want to use force, but I had no choice." His lawyer added, "The video is taken out of context. We're going to prove that the officer acted properly." These statements only fueled the fire. A crowd gathered outside the police station demanding that the officer be suspended. "We don't believe their words. It's always the same. They find excuses to protect their own," shouted an activist in the crowd. But what angered the public the most was the way the police tried to discredit Marcus himself. At one point, the local news published information that the teenager was allegedly in a group of teenagers suspected of petty theft. It was a lie, but it was quickly picked up. Linton Carter, Marcus's father, issued a loud statement. "They want to destroy my son's reputation to justify their violence. It's a tactic they've always used. They try to turn the victim into a criminal to cover up their own guilt. But this time it won't pass." His words spread as quickly as the video. People began looking for evidence to prove Marcus's innocence. Old school teachers, neighbors, friends, they all spoke publicly about how kind and honest this teenager was. The story was getting louder and louder. The police station came under even more pressure. The police chief was forced to issue a statement promising an objective investigation. But words no longer satisfied the people. They wanted action. In the midst of it all, Marcus sat at home, his leg still plastered, resting on a pillow. His dog lay beside him, his fur still ruffled from the fear he had experienced. He stared at the screen of his phone, where hundreds of messages of support were popping up. But he felt tired, broken. His life had changed in an instant, and he didn't know if it could go back to the way it was. Nevertheless, somewhere deep inside him, a small spark lit up. It was the same spark that burned in his father. He realized that this story was more than about himself. It was a fight for justice that he was a part of, whether he wanted to be or not. When it seemed that public and media attention had already peaked, the situation took an unexpected and grim turn. The police officer, under pressure after the video was made public, made a move that shocked everyone. He held a press conference where he tried to justify his actions by casting aspersions on the teenager lying on the ground. "This young man was behaving aggressively. He was provoking me. He had a dog that could attack, and he himself repeatedly refused to obey orders," the officer said with an icy expression on his face. His words were spoken with the confidence of a man who is used to being believed, regardless of the truth. Then he did something no one expected. He began attacking the reputation of Linton Carter, Marcus's father. His father is a man who for years has been discrediting the police, rioting and inciting people to disobedience. The son has clearly internalized his views. "It's not surprising," he continued, adding lies to the log line. The statement, picked up by some news outlets, angered black communities across the country. It was not just an insult. It was a direct challenge, an attempt to shift blame to those who were already suffering injustice. People began gathering in the streets with renewed vigor, chanting slogans against a system that seemed to look for any way to protect its employee, even at the cost of destroying the lives of the innocent. That same evening, a second wave of protests began. People came out with placards that read, "We don't believe your lies. Marcus is our son. Justice or revolution." Major cities were filled with marches blocking roads, but along with peaceful protests came clashes. In some places, tensions turned into riots. Stores closed, streets filled with tear gas fumes, and police lines clashed with crowds of protesters. Meanwhile, Linton Carter, realizing that the attack on his family was intentional, went on air on a major news channel. "This is not just an attack on my son or on me. This is an attempt to silence the truth. They want us to be silent, to make us feel guilty again about defending our lives. But it won't work," he said, looking straight into the camera. His voice was firm, but his eyes showed the weariness of a man who had fought the wind for years. However, after the interview, Linton received an anonymous warning. A message arrived on his phone. "Be careful, Carter. The system could break not only you, but your family as well." The message made him freeze. He realized that the fight had become much more dangerous than ever before. It soon became clear that the police had decided to dig deeper. They began spreading information about Marcus, claiming that he had allegedly had conflicts at school and that he had been repeatedly on the lookout for minor infractions, which later turned out to be completely made up. But the public, who had already seen the video, didn't believe those words. People were increasingly talking about how easily the system uses lies to protect its own. The situation was escalating by the minute. One of the most shocking scenes was when one of Linton's closest allies, a journalist supporting his campaigns, was suddenly arrested during a peaceful rally. He was charged with incitement, but footage taken by eyewitnesses proved his innocence. This only increased the fury of the protesters. In the midst of this chaos, Marcus remained at home, his leg still in a cast, and his dog never left his side. He didn't go outside, knowing that every time he appeared he could become a new target for hatred. But he saw the news, heard people saying his name in the crowd, and felt that the burden was too much for him. "Why do they hate us so much, Dad?" he once asked Linton, looking at him with eyes full of pain and incomprehension. His father sighed, lowering his gaze. "They don't hate us, son. We have to show that they can't dictate their rules to us." These words were leaked online, causing an even greater outcry. There came a moment when it became clear. This conflict was no longer about Marcus, no longer about Linton, but about an entire system that would either change or continue to destroy lives. But at what cost? The question remained open. The revelation came as suddenly as if the truth itself had pierced the armor of lies. A journalistic team working alongside activists gained access to internal police station documents that included reports of numerous complaints against an officer who assaulted a black teenager on crutches. These complaints, filed by different people over the past few years, revealed the same thing: abuse of power, excessive use of force, and racially charged insults. When this data came out in the public space, there was no longer any doubt. The policeman who had tried to defend himself by claiming that Marcus had provoked him was a symbol of everything the public was against. The public was not silent. The protests intensified and the number of people on the streets increased every day. Marcus watched from the window of his house. His cast no longer prevented him from getting up, but in his heart he still felt chained to the place where he had been humiliated, knocked down. Every night he woke up with nightmares. He saw that officer again, saw the glint of the taser, and heard his dog barking to protect him. These dreams kept him awake. "Dad, why does this keep happening?" he asked one day to Linton, who sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and telephones. Linton looked up, his face haggard but determined. "Because now we have a chance to make a difference. People see what's happened to you, son, and they don't want to be silent anymore. You've become a symbol, Marcus. Your name is the fight now." These words brought no comfort. Marcus felt that his life would never be the same again. Journalists were on duty in the street outside their house every day, waiting for comments. Crowds of people came to show their support. Occasionally, someone would leave treats at the door for the dog, who became a hero to many that day. But Marcus could feel this fame becoming a heavy burden. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for came. A police officer who had long concealed his true actions was suspended from duty. His case went to trial, and activists, including Linton Carter, continued to push for the maximum penalty. At trial, prosecutors used videotapes, eyewitness testimony, and journalistic evidence to prove that the officer's actions were not an accident. It was the system that gave him power and allowed him to abuse it. The court handed down the sentence. The officer was found guilty of abuse of authority, assault, and gross violation of professional ethics. He was sentenced to imprisonment and disqualified from working in law enforcement. This was a small victory for Marcus, his family, and for all those who fought for justice. But this victory could not erase the tragedy. Marcus was still afraid to go outside. Every time he saw a police car, his body tensed. His dog seemed to have changed too. She no longer approached strangers, even if they tried to give her a treat. She was always by Marcus's side, guarding him even at home. Linton Carter used the occasion to launch a new wave of change. He organized a campaign demanding police reform and became the face of a movement sweeping the country. He wrote articles, spoke at rallies, and said that his son's case was the rule, not the exception, and that it must be changed. His words were inspiring, but at home he was just a father who sat down next to Marcus every night to talk to him and make sure he didn't feel alone. This tragedy had left a mark that would never disappear. Marcus will never forget that day when he lay on the cold asphalt with eyes full of hatred staring back at him. But he will also never forget how people from all corners of the country rose up to protect him, to fight for him. This story was more than about Marcus. It was a story about injustice, about racism, about a system that must be broken and built anew. It was a story about how one incident can be a catalyst for change. But for Marcus, it was his life, his fear, his pain, his dog, who had been his only protector at a time when the whole world seemed hostile. And now, even as justice was served, he knew he would carry this story with him for the rest of his life. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your stories and opinions are very important to us, and we thank each of you for sharing your thoughts. We appreciate each of you and your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like if this story touched you. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul.